happening. Thank you for always being sovereign. And we ask that you would help us to benefit from this time, that we might understand your word better as we consider the time between the testaments. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Okay, today we are talking it's not really a Bible study, it's a study of the time between the Old Testament and the New Testament, sometimes called the intertestamental period. Who has this?
Yes.
I sent it out on a couple of the line groups. I don't know if anyone can upload it to the Zoom meeting. I don't know. For anybody who doesn't have it.
I can do it.
Okay, thank you. Julian, would you like to read Galatians 4:4? Galatians 4:4, your microphone is off.
What? 你看为什么会Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Yes.
When the set times had come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. Yeah.
啊，对，我们两个不能太近了，后退。我的声音传过去，你的声音又传过来了，后退，你后退一点。
Okay. Thank you. So in the fullness of time, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law. So God has his own timeline, his own plan for when he will do things. It's not our timeline, not the way we might like it to be. But we know from this verse that it was in the fullness of time that God sent forth his son. And so I'm going to look at how this was the fullness of time in a few different ways. Also remember when God told Abraham to go to Egypt, where your descendants will be in prison for 400 years until the sins of the Amorites are complete. So God is not just orchestrating one thing, he's orchestrating lots of things all around the world into his perfect plan. We see also in Daniel chapter 8, not as clear for us, but Daniel saw this vision of a ram and a male goat that came and struck the ram and so on. And then it says here in Daniel 8:20 through 22, the ram which you saw with the two horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. It could be Darius and Cyrus the Great. Maybe they're the same person, I don't know. And the shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece. And the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king. That's probably Alexander the Great. And the broken horn and the four horns that arose in its place represent four kingdoms which will arise from his nation, although not with his power. So Daniel was being told about the future, this time period in between the testaments. I have a little simple timeline here, just to basically show the different time periods. The Persian period, the Greek period, which I've split into two parts, the Hasmonean period, or the Maccabean, sometimes known as the independent period, and then the Roman Empire. So we have basically, think of, I'm going to talk about the rise of the Greeks, the rise of the Romans, and the state of the Jewish nation in the time between the Testaments. So think of those three things. First, the rise of Greece. At the end of the Old Testament, the Jews were ruled by Persia. Here is the Persian Empire. This is a weird color because it looks like it's water. This is not water. This is the Persian Empire. Here is Israel. Israel is this tiny little piece of land on the far western side of the Persian Empire. So they came in and they took Israel, Babylon took Israel away, the Judah away. They kept them there for 70 years. They came back. Still over here, you had Esther, you had Nehemiah later. But this is where they are, just this little bit of land in this massive empire. Now the Persians had ruled, but they had also tried to take Greece. But they didn't take Greece successfully. They didn't send in enough men, and they lost a couple famous battles, the Battle of Marathon, Thermopylae. And the Greeks at this time, they weren't a nation, they were city-states. So there was Athens, there was Sparta, there were other cities that sometimes made a league together, but then afterwards they ended up fighting each other in the Peloponnesian Wars. And they got weaker over time. And they didn't get defeated by Persia, they got defeated by this little area right up here, Macedonia. You might remember in Acts, Paul receives a vision from a man from Macedonia, says, come over and help us. Paul had come up here through Turkey and was up against the sea. And he went over here to the first city. Remember what city that was? Anyone? It was Philippi, right? Well, he went to a couple of little places first, but he went down to Philippi, which was a city with Roman citizenship status. But Philippi was named after the king of Macedonia, Philip. And Philip had a son who's more famous than he is, but Philip conquered Greece. So Greece got conquered not by each other, not by the Persian Empire, but from this little area right here, Macedonia. Came down, and Philip had a son whose name was Alexander the Great. There he is with a big head. This is maybe my daughter's first biography that she had to read. There's hardly a bigger figure in Western history than Alexander the Great. Alexander comes down, he's this goat, the shaggy goat that comes down. He rules over Greece, but he's not from Greece, he's from Macedonia. But he has a Greek teacher. Aristotle is his personal tutor. And Aristotle is pretty much the biggest philosopher in Western history. And Alexander is, he's a warrior, and he wants to come and destroy the Persian Empire. So he takes a boat across the water. Before he even gets there, he throws his spear out of the boat and sticks it in the land to claim Persia for Alexander. He always had these visions of being great and powerful. Well, he quickly sweeps down through basically everywhere the Persian Empire was, almost the exact same map. But he sweeps down across Israel and then down into Egypt first. And then up here, all around Afghanistan, all the way into India and back. He conquers all of this in 10 years. 10 years time, he sweeps over the entire Persian Empire, and then he dies at the age of like 31, something like this. So he accomplished more than most of us do by the time we're 30. And all along the way, he was spreading Greek culture and the Greek language. And he was establishing cities, often naming them after himself. So one of the first major cities that he established was Alexandria, obviously named after himself, in Egypt. And Alexandria became a very important city for Jews. It was in Egypt that the Bible, the Old Testament, was translated into Greek. Most of this was done, I think, in Alexandria. A big section, I think they had, I don't know, maybe a third of the people, I don't know, were Jews there or something. There was a big Jewish community in Egypt. You may remember Jeremiah and others fled to Egypt in the time of the exile. And there was a community there that grew. So they translated the Bible into Greek, and it was very important because this is when the New Testament writers quote the Old Testament, they're using this Greek Bible called the Septuagint. And it was translated about 250 for the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, and the rest of it was done by about 130 BC. So Greek has spread as the common language, and Jews are spread around the empire a bit in different cities, Alexandria, Antioch, and so on. One person we know who was from Alexandria was Apollos. Joanne, would you like to read Acts 18, verse 24?
有一个犹太人名叫亚波罗，来到以弗所。他生在亚历山大，是有学问的，最能讲解圣经。
So there was a big Jewish community there, and Apollos was from this community. They had also mixed over time with the Greek culture there in Egypt. There was another guy, a Jewish philosopher, historian by the name of Philo, who was one of the most important, I guess, historians, probably second most important Jewish historian of the time after Josephus. So this has the result of Jews being mixed with Greek culture, and that starting to influence their way of thinking, their way of doing things, but also has a way of establishing some Jewish culture in Greek-speaking areas. And so some people, like say Cornelius or others later on, they become God-fearers. They like what they hear about the God of the Jews, but they haven't become Jewish themselves. They're still outsiders, but they might pray to God or something. If anybody has any question at any time about any of this, just jump in there and feel free to ask. Any questions so far? Okay. So Alexander spreads across the world in 10 years, and then he dies on the way. But he tries to get his troops to go into India, and they're tired of fighting. They don't want to go in, and they want to go back. He doesn't make it back. He dies before ever returning to Macedonia, and they build a nice casket for him, and they carry it back. But his kingdom splits into 4 parts, 3 major parts, just like it said in Daniel, that the one horn would fall away and then 4 little horns arise in its place, but not with the power of the first king. So that brings us to this map here, where Alexander's kingdom splits almost. It's splitting really while he's still alive, but it splits after he dies among his generals. And the 2 sections that you really need to know about are the Egyptian section called the Seleucids, and the Persian. This part here is the Seleucid, and this is the Ptolemaic Empire. So the Seleucid is the big one. The Ptolemaic is this Egyptian one. But at first, or quickly, Israel is under control of the Ptolemaic, the Egyptian part of the Greek Empire. And for the most part, they're pretty nice to Israel. They don't require many changes, and they just let them do their thing. And this goes on from about 300 to 200 BC. This is when they translate the Bible in the Septuagint. But afterwards, the Seleucid part, the Persian part of the Greek Empire, came down and took over Israel. And this is when it gets bad. There were several rulers who ruled over Israel, and they had a little bit more of a policy of trying to get Israel to change, to become more Greek. Finally, a guy came along whose name was Antiochus. He called himself Epiphanes, which means God manifest. Some other people call him Epimanes as a joke, I guess, which means, I think, the crazy one, the mad one. But he was very into his own glory, and he was just a ruthless guy. He ruled the Seleucid Empire from about 175 to 164 BC. And he wanted more. He wanted the Ptolemaic Empire too. He wanted to conquer Egypt and not just Israel. But he was afraid of the Romans. By this time, the Romans have been growing for a while now, and they're getting bigger and bigger out in the West, in Europe. And Antiochus has already fought the Romans, at least a couple times, I think, and lost. And so he doesn't want to bother with them, but he wants Egypt. So he goes down into Egypt with an army to fight the Egyptians. And when he gets there, there's a single old Roman man standing on the beach, not a warrior, an ambassador. And he says, Rome wants you to turn around and not fight Egypt. Rome didn't want the power to solidify. They liked the Egyptians more, I think. And Antiochus said, I have to think about this. I need to consult my generals. And the man drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus with his stick and said, you are allowed to think for as long as you want, but Rome demands your answer before you leave this circle. And this really ticked him off. he didn't want to go in and fight Rome. So he retreated after just one old Roman man. And he decided to basically take out his anger on Israel on the way back. So he comes back. He had already been corrupting Israel. He was appointing high priests for money, and even first there was a high priest of the line of Zadok, and there was another guy who's of the line of Zadok who wanted to be high priest, and he paid him money. He said, "If I give you money, will you make me high priest?" And he's like, "Okay, sure." And the Jews didn't like this really, but he was of the line of Zadok. He was of the priestly line. And then somebody else who wasn't from the line of Zadok at all said, "What if I pay you more money? Will you make me high priest?" And he was like, "Okay." And this was a turning point. The more zealous Jews got really upset with what he was doing. But then he comes back and he basically tries to, when he's in Egypt, they get word that Antiochus has died. He hasn't died, but they think he died. So they put a high priest from the line of Zadok back into power. And Antiochus takes this as rebellion. So he goes in there and just starts slaughtering the Jews. And he defiles the temple. He tries to start eliminating Jewish religion altogether. So if you weren't allowed to be circumcised or circumcise your children, you weren't allowed to read the Bible. He was burning the Bible anywhere he found it. He took the temple and he made it a temple to worship Zeus. And he had people sacrificing pigs to Zeus in the Jerusalem temple. So you can only imagine how upsetting this would be to the Jews. So this was the time called the abomination of desolation that you read about in Daniel, and also Jesus made reference to it, of what had happened. So this is the Jewish experience. This is about from 167 to 164 BC. This had happened, and they had defiled the Jewish religion as much as they possibly could. And it went on for 3 years. The lowest period, I guess, in this whole time. Then in 164 BC, a priest by the name of Mattathias and his 5 sons led a revolt against the Greeks, their rulers, and they won. They drove them out and they restored the temple. They had a service to rededicate this temple in December 164 BC. And so about this time in December, maybe that instead of celebrating Christmas, the Jews celebrate something they call Hanukkah, right? So this is the service of rededication, the celebration when Antiochus Epiphanes was driven out, and Jewish rule was established over Israel again. His son, Mattathias' son, who was the hero of all this, was a guy named Judas. And they called him Judas Maccabeus, the hammer. That's what they call him. So he was they had like guerrilla warfare, not your normal priest. These guys were soldiers too, I guess. And they led battles and stuff, and they ruled from then on for the next 100 years, really. So from about 164 to 37 BC was the period of the Hasmonean dynasty. And so they grew, and they even expanded down south into the area of Edom, Idumea, where Herod is from. And Herod is incorporated into Israel. His family he's the Idumean from Edom. And he comes over, he's kind of half Jewish. And the Hasmonean line, the line of Mattathias and his sons, grew more corrupt until it was even pagan. And they began to fight with one another over this time of independence. They weren't totally independent. It's just they had more independence than before. They're still kind of in a bigger empire. So at some point, they asked Rome to help them settle a dispute as to who the leader is, and Rome settles it. They say basically, Rome is the leader. So instead of telling them which guy was going to be in charge, they just really took over. And so now, instead of being the westernmost country of the westernmost part of the Persian Empire, they become the easternmost part of the Roman Empire, way over here. So it's kind of interesting. Israel is at the crossroads of the world, in between Africa and Asia and Europe. And at this point, the Persian Empire, they're right here on this edge. And then, they're over here on this edge of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had grown from Italy, this boot, and taken over all of Italy, and then it just grew, took over Greece, Spain, Greece, everything, over hundreds of years. So the Roman Republic had been growing since 500 BC, since before Alexander the Great was born. And the Roman general Pompey invaded Israel in 63 and allowed Israel to continue as a state. So this is still kind of the Hasmonean period, the independent period, but now they're under Roman rule instead of Greek rule. But he also comes in and desecrates the Holy of Holies. Pompey enters in there. And the Jews don't like this either. They don't like, having a Greek guy, Antiochus, do it, and they don't like having a Roman guy do it either. Any questions so far about any of this? I know this is a lot of names, places maybe you're not familiar with. Well, after this, the Roman Republic, the Romans had kicked out their kings hundreds of years earlier, and they were ruled by a senate. And it remained that way for hundreds of years, and they didn't want a king until this guy took over. Julius Caesar. And he is basically as big in Western history as Alexander the Great. In fact, Julius Caesar, when he was over in Spain, was reading a book about Alexander the Great. And he was like, man, I haven't done as much as Alexander. I need to do that. And so he started conquering things too, conquering France, conquering Spain. And he just took over. Everything is named after this guy right here, Julius Caesar. The C-section is named after the Caesar salad. The month of July is named after Julius Caesar. Yeah,
C-section?
I think so, yeah. I think he had a strange birth himself. He's got lots of stories, but yeah, he named everything after himself. But like German Kaisers were named after Caesar. The rulers of Rome later on were named after Caesar. The Russian czars were named after Caesar. So this guy is just about as big as they get in Western history. And just as big as him is the guy who ruled after him, his nephew, his adopted son, Octavian, who named himself Caesar Augustus. So the month of July is named after Julius Caesar. The month of August, named after Caesar Augustus. And the other months, most of the other months, are named after Roman gods, Greek gods. So they promoted themselves as Lord. Caesar Augustus called himself Lord and Savior. He brings peace on earth because, by bringing war, they bring this period of peace. So, but Julius Caesar was not Caesar. He was a dictator, not an emperor. He ruled for a while, and there was a guy who helped him, I think, Antipater, the Idumean, and Caesar was friends with him. Julius Caesar was friends with him, and he promoted him. And his son was placed in power over Israel. His son, Antipater's son, was Herod the Great. And so the Herods were kind of in between Jewish and Roman. So Herod the Great ruled Israel. There I've got the picture. There's Julius. There's Augustus. These two guys. So Herod was declared king of the Jews a little bit after Julius Caesar had been killed, but Caesar Augustus took his place afterwards. And when Caesar Augustus ruled, the Lord Jesus was born. So when Jesus is born, Herod is called the king of the Jews, and they haven't had a king in a long time. And he's not of David's line. But Israel he's like a king under Caesar Augustus. So he's still part of the Roman kingdom. And Herod was the guy, was a great builder. He built stuff outside of Israel too, but he built the city of Caesarea Maritima on the sea of the Mediterranean Sea on the coast there. He built a temple to Caesar Augustus there at Caesarea Maritima. He also built up the temple quite large. So he tried to stay in power, tried to please the Jews by building up the temple, and he tried to please the Caesars and Caesar and the Romans by building a Roman type city in Israel and building a temple to Caesar. What he really wanted was power. And so when Jesus was born, he tried to have him killed. Matthew chapter 2. Naomi, would you like to read Matthew chapter 2? Verse 16 through 18. Or just verse 16. And your microphone's off.
OK， 希律见自己被星象家愚弄了，就大怒，于是照着他从星象家所问得的日子，下令把伯利恒和附近的地方2岁及以下的小孩全都杀死了。这就应验了耶利米先知所说的，在拉玛所听见有声音，是痛哭的，极大哀嚎的声音。拉结为他的儿女哀哭，不肯受安慰，因为他们都不在了。
Thank you. So now we have a very complicated situation in Israel, but just to recap it, the Persian Empire gets destroyed by Alexander the Great. This guy. And his kingdom falls apart immediately. And it's ruled by, Israel is then ruled by the Egyptian part of the Greek Empire for 100 years or so. And then they're ruled for a while by the Persian part, the Syrian part, the northern part. And it's a really bad time. The temple's desecrated. There's a rebellion, and this lasts for 100 years that the Jews have independent rule over their nation. And then the Romans come, Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus. And Herod is appointed as a under ruler in Israel. Caesar Augustus calls himself the son of God because they treated Julius Caesar like a god. Julius Caesar adopted Caesar Augustus. And so Caesar Augustus called himself the son of the divine. So he's the son of God, calls himself Lord, he calls himself Savior. And so this all is an interesting context for the Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, to be born into an obscure part of this Roman kingdom. Now we get to the New Testament, and the New Testament is a world that seems just completely different from the Old Testament. The Persian, like when we left the Persians, like when we turn the page from Malachi to Matthew, we go from Persian rule to Roman rule. Jesus' mother, Mary, and Joseph, her husband, have to come down to Bethlehem because of a Roman decree for the census. There are Roman soldiers everywhere in Israel. So in Rome itself, no army was allowed. Outside of Rome, they didn't have a need for an army because everything was loyal to Rome. But on the edges of the Roman Empire, where there might be revolts, they had soldiers, they had armies, and Israel is on the edge. So they always have soldiers there in Rome. They have Roman government, Roman law, Roman adoption, slavery, education, money, taxes, citizenship, and all of these things play a role in our understanding of the New Testament. For instance, here's a small example. Slaves were often highly educated in the Roman Empire, and you would sometimes, a wealthy person would hire a slave to teach their children. And so this is kind of the context for in Galatians when it talks about the law is like a tutor, that slave tutor who is over the children until they come of age. If you remember that passage, I don't know. So this would have, or the concept of adoption, even the concept of justification has kind of a Roman background as well. The legal way of viewing things. Taxes that Jesus had to deal with. Remember, they asked him, "Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar?" And he said, whose image is on there? And they said, Caesar. And so, render to Caesar what's Caesar's, and to God what is God's. So you have this. This is the world. The New Testament world is a Roman world. So, but the Roman world was also a Greek-influenced world. So they took on the Greek gods and they renamed them. They had Greek scholars and philosophers influencing them. They had Greek architecture, and the Greek language still was everywhere. And in this way, God was preparing for the gospel to go out. So we have a saying in English, all roads lead to Rome, because the Romans were master road builders, and they built roads connecting the whole empire. And in this way, they made it really easy for the spread of the gospel when that came. And everywhere was using the Greek language, and that made it also easy the spread of the gospel all over the empire. In a similar way, I think, to Mao Zedong, who simplifies the Chinese language and makes everybody use the Beijing dialect, and he builds roads, he built up the infrastructure of China, and he doesn't have the advancement of the gospel in mind at all, but he basically becomes God's unpaid servant in preparing China for the spread of the gospel. He doesn't realize God's ruling over him the whole time for the good of the church, even though he's a wicked man, just like Caesar Augustus, just like Julius Caesar, just like Alexander. God is sovereign over all of it. Okay, so that leads us to now Israel. Does anybody have any questions about anything so far, the history? No questions? Is this new? Is this old information for you? Is there anything new? Okay, well, I hope that's helpful to get the context a little bit. Israel now, consider Israel. Israel, the Jewish religion, the Jewish nation in the Old Testament at its height was a religion of mediators. We had kings, prophets, and priests. Jesus, the Christ, is prophet, priest, and king, right? Well, the kings were gone. The last king, Zedekiah, was removed. He had his children killed in front of his face, and then his eyes put out. In 2 Kings 25:7. He is the last really king to rule over Israel. So for more than almost 600 years, by the time Jesus has arrived, there have been no kings. Herod calls himself a king, but the Jews don't really see him as their own. And he rules under Rome. Also, the priests in the Hasmonean period, they ruled, but they weren't really kings. The kingly line seems like it's gone, but they were hoping for a king who would come to them. Behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on, a foal of a donkey, right? So they're expecting the coming king. Their prophets have been gone for 400 years. You just turn the page over, but it's 400 years go by with no more prophets being added. You think about, if you flip back through the minor prophets, most of those minor prophets and the major prophets were written in a span of about 300 years, all of them. So you got all these prophets, and then for 400 years you have nothing. And so it's a period of silence. And the priests were corrupted. Antiochus Epiphanes appointed priests for money. And then he appointed priests who were outside the line of Zadok. Does anybody remember who Zadok was? Zadok's one of the most important Old Testament people that you're not that familiar with. He doesn't get that much attention, but Zadok ruled, was high priest in David's lifetime. He was the first high priest over the temple that Solomon built. Zadok is the one who coronated King Solomon. So from that time on, the high priest had always been from the line of Zadok. And so this line was very important for them. The high priest, in a world where there are no prophets and there are no kings, is the most important guy in Israel. And so he kind of rules. I mean, with the Maccabees, who were, I think, of the line of Zadok, they were the rulers over Israel. So there's still this mixture of religion and civil power with the priests. At some point, there's kind of a senate, a council that's formed in Israel called the Sanhedrin. I don't know how you say this in Chinese, Sanhedrin, but I'm sure you've heard this word in Chinese, the Sanhedrin. So this council, I think about 70 or 72 people, something like this, they ruled over Israel under the king, Herod, but the head of the Sanhedrin was the high priest. So the high priest is very important, but the high priesthood has become corrupted. Over time, they start becoming high priest just by money. So say in Aaron's time or in Zadok's time, you were high priest until you died. But it gets more confusing with people, buying it for money and it being given to one person, given to another person, and these people being corrupt and pagan sometimes. So there was the corruption of the priesthood. Not only this, when Zadok's line got kicked out of the temple and they saw that they weren't going to be high priest again, they decided they're going to go build their own temple. And so they get permission to build a rival temple in Egypt. Maybe you've never heard of this, but the line of the priests from Zadok continue ministering and offering sacrifices at the Jewish temple in Egypt until after the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed. So this is crazy. There's two temples with the right priests in the Egyptian temple. But that didn't change the fact that they weren't supposed to do that. So you have rival temples, you have corrupt priests, and then in AD 70, you have the destruction of the temple. So what's left now that you have the priest gone, the king's gone, the prophet's gone? People, the Jewish religion today does not look very much like it looked in the Old Testament. Because so much of the religion revolved around the temple and the priesthood, and they're gone. The king is gone. The prophets are gone. What's left? The teachers, the rabbis, the synagogue. So we have the rise of the synagogue. After the temple was destroyed, and in the first time, Israel was taken away to Babylon. And there they continued serving God, but without a temple. And maybe they realized, hey, it's possible. They continued teaching people the law and morals and Jewish history and so on from the synagogues. And these synagogues were built in every city. So when Paul travels around in his missionary journeys, the first place he goes to every time is what? The synagogue, right? He goes and he preaches at the Jewish synagogue there where they're already familiar with Moses and so on. And so Paul goes and he preaches from the Psalms, from the Old Testament, showing that the Christ that they're expecting is Jesus. It was Jesus. And then he shows how it pointed to Jesus, how Jesus fulfilled that. And so he would get them to convert or to accept Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. And so in this way, God was also preparing people, the Jews all over to come to Christ. But these rabbis, the teachers, weren't even in agreement among themselves. There were different schools. The two main schools in Jesus' time were the school of Shammai and Hillel, I think. And Hillel had a student, Gamaliel, who taught Paul. So they would argue with each other about the law and about tradition. So we have the rise of the synagogues. These teachers become the leaders of the religion. The Sanhedrin became more and more like a court. They would pass judgment on things, or they would rule over civil affairs, but they didn't do that much religiously anymore. So the holy man, the teachers are the synagogue leaders, the rabbis. Any question about that? Yes.
Could you say a little bit about what we know of what went on at the synagogue, in the synagogues during Sabbath? What kind of meetings they have usually? Do you have any information on that?
I do. That was at the last part. The synagogue, very important for us because the worship of the early church, and indeed the church today, is much more based off the synagogue than the temple. Right? We don't have like a holy place in the church, unless you're Catholic, I guess, where only the priest can go behind the veil and work their hocus pocus on the Lord's Supper, which is exactly where the word hocus pocus comes from. Hoc est corpus meum, this is my body, in Latin became the phrase hocus pocus. So behind the veil there. But the synagogue they would go to school there. And so Jesus would have gone to that synagogue in Nazareth, where they would learn as boys how to read. They would learn the Bible. But on the Sabbath, they would come together and they would have prayer, a set of prayers, and they call them benedictions at the beginning, where there's just a lot of set prayers, and then afterwards they would read the law. So the synagogues in the east of Palestine would read through the law, the Pentateuch, every year. So they would read several chapters each week. And the ones in the west would read through the Pentateuch every 3 years. So they had a different schedule for reading. In my Hebrew Bible, I actually have it marked out. I mean, it comes marked out where the week's reading would go to each week. After they did an Old Testament reading from the Pentateuch, they would usually have a lesson from the prophets. So if you want to turn to Luke chapter 4, verse 16, we have Jesus preaching at the synagogue. Luke 4, verse 16 through 18. Tim, do you want to read that?
Yeah. And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as was his custom, he he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day and he stood up to read.
Verse 17 as well.
And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written.
And then he read Isaiah 61. So this here, Luke 4, is I think the oldest record that there is of a synagogue service. We have much more detail later on, so we're kind of speculating as to what the synagogue service looked like before this time, because this is the oldest one we have, Luke 4. But notice Jesus is given a scroll to read, and he reads from the prophet Isaiah. So this is not the Pentateuch reading, this is the prophet reading. And the reading of the Pentateuch would be in order. So you'd start, just like we're doing at New Hope, we'll go do the next chapter each week. They would go through in order of the Pentateuch, but not in order with the prophets. Instead, they chose a section from the prophets that they thought fit well with the reading from the law. This goes to show a little bit of their view of the Old Testament, with the Pentateuch really being the body and the prophets more like the appendages, arms and legs, that they're connected to the body, but not as important really to them as the law. I mean, the prophets quote the law all the time, not the other way around, right? But then again, Moses was a prophet, so I don't know why the difference is there exactly. But so after doing a reading from the prophets, they would have a word of exhortation. Someone like to read? Mom, would you like to read Acts 13, verse 14?
Okay. Get there. Verse 14. Can you hear
Yes.
me?
Yes. No, yes, 14 through 16.
Okay. But going on from Perga, they arrived in Pisidian, Antioch, and on the Sabbath day they went into the synagogue and sat down. And after the reading of the law and the prophets, the synagogue officials sent to them, saying, "Brethren, if you have any word of exhortation for the people, say it." And Paul stood up, and motioning with his hand, he said, "Men of Israel, and you who fear God, listen."
So then he preaches a sermon. Jesus had preached a sermon, remember, in Luke. I'm not sure what it all said, but he said, essentially, this passage in Isaiah has now been fulfilled in your hearing. I'm the Messiah. And Paul preaches a sermon called a word of exhortation here at this first Sabbath in Pisidian Antioch in Acts 13. So if you look at that, you'll see an example of a synagogue sermon. What's interesting is this phrase, word of exhortation, is also used of the book of Hebrews. At the end, it says, I have written this word of exhortation to you briefly. So Hebrews is essentially a long sermon, arguing a lot of the same things, right? So it might be an example of the type of things that Paul would be preaching in the synagogues. And then the service was concluded with a blessing. One thing that I think is missing from the synagogue service, maybe they had it, but it doesn't seem to be nearly as emphasized as we emphasize it, is singing. But so the church service is, Paul writes, to sing. hymns, songs, spiritual songs. That's definitely part of our worship. So not everything is taken from the synagogue, but you see what happens at the synagogue is much more similar to what we do at church each week than what you would see in the temple, with animals getting killed and places where you can't go and priests walking around, so on. So that's the synagogue. That's kind of important, the rise of the synagogue for our understanding of the New Testament. But let me get back to the Jews a little bit. I had yes.
Do we know what kind of hymn? Did they use Psalter only, or did they use piano? They have piano?
They did not have piano. I don't know if they used music, but they used the Psalms. And it seems like there's some songs written in the New Testament as well, called Christological hymns and things. I'm sure the exclusive psalmodists would probably disagree, but I don't think we really know. But I had this phrase right here, bolded right here. It's not a very well-written sentence, but it's an important one. I'm gonna read it. It says, mixing the Jewish diaspora and Hellenization. This mixing also led to internal division. This is important, though. If you understand this, then everything else kind of starts fitting together. The Jewish diaspora is the dispersion. So James says, it starts off saying, to the 12 tribes scattered abroad, greetings, right? So Israel has been scattered, and with this scattering, they have mixed with Greek culture and Roman culture. They've taken on some philosophy, especially say in Egypt and elsewhere. They've taken on some of the magical practices of the Romans in some places. They've been corrupted. And they've also been corrupted in Israel. There's been mixing. This process is called Hellenization. Hellas is Greek. It's how you say Greece in the Greek language, Hellas. So Hellenization is that they become more Greek. Their culture has been shifting. And the Greeks have learned a little bit more about Israel, and so there's God-fearers and so on. So there's this mixing with the culture around them. And this mixing causes division. That sounds a little strange. Mixing causes division. But imagine if, this is a terrible example. It's the only one in my head right now. If China tries to take over Taiwan, okay, and say they do it by corrupting the officials and so on, there's going to be Taiwanese leaders who say, yes, China, I will serve you. Just let me have a high position afterwards. This would happen in any culture, in any takeover, really. There's going to be some people who go with the new rulers, and thus they get into high positions of power, like Herod. This is what happened with Herod. You know, he tried to appeal to Rome and help Rome and serve Rome, and so his position was secured by Rome. But then on the other hand, you have people who hate the people who are conforming to the Greek culture and who react to it. Some will react and just run away like monks into the wilderness. And so there's this one group of Jews that arise called the Essenes. And they're like monks, basically. They live in the wilderness and elsewhere. They don't get married, usually. They grow by attracting followers. And so they They share everything in common, and they're very concerned about ritual purity. So concerned about it that they won't even sacrifice anymore in the temple because they think the temple is defiled. So they were well thought of by most Israelites. So again, you're in Taiwan, you walk down the street and you see somebody in an orange robe, it's a monk. And you might identify as a Buddhist, or somebody might identify as a Buddhist, but you're not a Buddhist like they are Buddhists, right? They're like extreme, and people respect them. You might not know about them, but you might be somewhat attracted to it, right? They're like, oh, that's a really good Buddhist or something. Well, it was like this way in Israel too. So the Essenes were like that. They were like these monks that lived out there in the wilderness, kind of like John the Baptist. And they try to maintain their purity by just being separate. When someone wanted to become Essene, they would have to live with them for a year or something, and then they would be trained for a year, and then they would be baptized. And then after 2 more years, they could join. So you see some interesting parallels there, right? With John the Baptist, perhaps. They were like little monastic communities. But there were also a couple different groups that were in power that had different reactions to the mixing with the culture around them. One of these groups was called the Pharisees. Now, I'm sure you all know about the Pharisees. They're quite prominent in the Gospels. So the Pharisees were this group of Israelites, mostly in Jerusalem, who were very concerned about law keeping. They did not like the mixing with the Greek culture. And so they reacted against it, and they formed a little group. Even if you go to Israel today, you'll see most of the Jews don't care that much about the Jewish religion. But then you'll see these guys who are like the black hats and the long sideburns, and they'll have the cloak. These guys are the Hasidic Jews. That's like the Pharisees at the time. They're more intense. So they are very focused on ritual purity, food laws, the Sabbath, tithing. They would not only tithe for things that Deuteronomy commands them to tithe, like oil and wheat, but they would also tithe their garden herbs, mint and cumin and stuff. So they were like, and they thought, oh, I'm better than others about this. So for example, Luke 18, George, would you like to read Luke 18, verse 9?
Luke 18, verse 9.
Verse 10 through 12.
Okay, verse 10 to 12. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood up and prayed about himself. God, I thank you that I am not like other men, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector.
Verse 12.
Okay. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get.
Okay. So fasting was supposed to be done, I think, once a year, and they would do it twice a week. And this was something clearly that they're bragging about here in this prayer. I pay tithes of everything. I fast. So they were very focused on these things. Now, Paul was a Pharisee. Now, here's some of the things that the Pharisees believed. They believed in the resurrection of the body. They believed in the judgment to come. They believed in hierarchies, like levels of angels and demons. They believed in God's sovereignty over the universe, and they believed in predestination. You hear those things and you go, yes, I believe those things too, right? I mean, we see those things in the Bible. They're not wrong about that. In addition to believing these things, they believed in an oral law that accompanied the Old Testament. So they believed that Moses was given the Pentateuch, basically, that he wrote the Pentateuch, but on the mountain, God also gave him a secret message. Don't write this down, just tell people this. And this was the oral tradition, and that was passed down from generation to generation. Obviously, this didn't happen, but this is their story, right? So this oral law was just as much from God as the Pentateuch, really. And Jesus rejected it. So he called it the traditions of men, right? You remember that, right? So they had these traditions that they would argue about. Now, the Sadducees were a little bit different. Actually, they were a lot different. But they were more political. They were just a group of a few wealthy landowning families, really. And they're the upper class. And they were connected. They held most of the power in the Sanhedrin Council. So there was a ruler who liked the Pharisees, and he wanted to be respected by the Pharisees. And he said, if I ever go astray, you let me know. Feel free to correct me. And a Pharisee stood up right then and said, okay, I'll correct you right now. If you really want to be pure and do the right thing, you need to step down from being high priest. And the guy didn't like that at all. After that, he sided with the Sadducees, and the Sadducees grew in power in the council. And so in Jesus' day, the Sadducees really rule over the council, but the people don't really like them. The people respect the Pharisees. Now, most of the people aren't part of any of these groups. They're not Pharisees, they're not Zealots, Essenes, or Sadducees. They're just workers, carpenters, fishermen, just trying to get by, and they were looked down by others. In John 7:49, it says, oh, this crowd that does not know the law. That's how people look down at the people. But there were God-fearers like Simon the Zealot, Simon in the temple, and others who were looking forward to Christ to come. You remember, if we go back, I'm going to read from Malachi real quick. Malachi chapter 3, verse 16. This was a corrupt time where people were saying, it doesn't pay to serve God. Does God really love us? And so on. But then it says this, then those who feared the Lord spoke to one another, and the Lord gave attention and heard it, and a book of remembrance was written before him for those who fear the Lord and esteem his name. So in Israel, there was this group, even in Malachi, of really true believers who would meet together and were talking with each other in a world where the church was mostly corrupt. And you can see right there, that's like the beginning of Pharisees or Sadducees or Essenes or Zealots forming little groups within Israel. And that just continued over time. So the Sadducees' beliefs were quite different from the Pharisees. They did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. They did not believe in rewards and punishments in the day of judgment. They did not believe in angelic and demonic hierarchies. And they did not believe in predestination. And you might say, well, they're wrong on all of those things, right?
The Armenians.
Yeah, they're Armenian.
Yeah.
you don't believe in the resurrection. They sound almost like Socinian in some of this stuff, but the Sadducees themselves regarded themselves as old believers. They thought they were more traditional than the Pharisees. They rejected the traditions. They rejected the oral law as we would reject it. But it seems like maybe they held to the Pentateuch and not to the prophets, perhaps. So you remember the Sadducees came up to Jesus and said, tell us, if a man was married and he died, and the woman married his brother, and then he died and they married his brother, and he died, married 7 of these brothers, and they all died. So in the resurrection, which one of them is she married to? So they were testing Jesus about the resurrection, and Jesus said, you don't understand God's power or the Bible. And then he quotes from the Pentateuch to rebuke them. God is not the God. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's not the God of the dead, but of the living. For all live to God. And in that passage in Matthew there, you see other people testing him with things that different groups. So the Pharisees would test him. What is the greatest commandment? And Jesus would answer. The Sadducees would test him about the resurrection. Others would test him, like the Essenes or the Zealots. They didn't like having images of anyone on a coin. And they didn't like having to pay taxes to Caesar. And so they would ask him, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? And he would say, tell them, look at this image. Whose image is it? So you see Jesus, we see some things about the Essenes that we might like. We see some things about the Pharisees that we agree with. We reject the oral law like the Sadducees. So the Christianity is something different than these groups, but they're not all wrong. So in Acts 23, it's worth reading. Acts 23, verse 6 through 9. Paul is arrested. I'll read it here, verse 6 through 9. But perceiving that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, Paul began crying out in the council, that's the Sanhedrin, brethren, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I am on trial for the hope and resurrection of the dead. And as soon as he said this, there arose a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor an angel, nor a spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. So that's kind of an important passage where you see all of the stuff that I'm saying illustrated. So Paul just stands up and says, I'm on trial for the belief in the resurrection of the dead. And the Sanhedrin just erupts because you've got the Sadducees who control most of it and who have the money and they have the political power, but the Pharisees have the social power. They have the respect of the people, and they're more knowledgeable generally. And they just start going at it. And Paul, I imagine Paul just sneaking out in the middle of this battle. And then there were also the Zealots. They looked back to Phineas, to Elijah, to Mattathias, people who violently took out the wicked. There was even a group called the Sicarii, which means daggers. And the Sicarii, this is another reaction. So to the mixing, some people would just, like the Essenes, would just run away. Some people, like the Sadducees, would try to get power. Some of the Pharisees try to keep the law, but they're much more focused on law keeping than they are things like sacrifice and justification by another's death, right? They're missing out that in the synagogue, really. And others would violently oppose the mixing. And so when Paul comes down to Jerusalem, he is accused of bringing a Gentile into the temple. You might remember this in Acts. And he almost loses his life over just this accusation. Right? So there was the Sicarii, and they would hold these daggers in their cloaks. And if there was someone who was following the Greek ways and was perverting the Jewish religion, sometimes they would just come out in the middle of a crowd and just stab you in the middle of a crowd and like sneak out through the crowd. This happened kind of frequently. So it was like people were watching their backs as they walk around in the street, because you never know when you're going to get stabbed by some zealot. So it was a tense age. Don't just think of the Greeks as ruling over the Jews and the Jews hating it. There were a lot of Jews who conformed to the Greeks. There were Jews who tried to withdraw into the desert, into the wilderness. There were Jews who wanted to fight back and stab people, stab not just Greeks, but stab Jews who they thought were conforming too much to the Greeks. And so this mixing, causing this division, leads to all these different groups, these different reactions. Finally, there's the messianic hope that we see in the New Testament, which I don't need to speak about a lot, but it's kind of the best part. We see it all over the New Testament, all over the Old Testament, the hope of a coming king, a suffering servant, a prophet like Moses, a king of the line of David, a priest according to the order of Melchizedek, a son of God who would rule over the nations with a rod of iron. And would just bring the salvation that they're all hoping for. But at this time, the salvation that most people are thinking of is salvation from the enemies, salvation from Romans, that they might worship God, as Zechariah says, without fear. For freedom, not freedom from sin, freedom from oppressors. And so they have this background of the Greeks and the Romans oppressing them, defiling them, corrupting them from within. You have the Herods. The Herods is a whole nother story. Their family is really complicated. I don't have time to get into. I don't even know it very clearly because it's all family tree is just weird and mixed. But after Herod had a son who ruled. He had three sons. One ruled down in Jerusalem. One ruled up in Galilee. Later on, he was called a king. But the ones in Jerusalem, they were not kings. They were governors. And the most famous governor later on was Pontius Pilate. So Pontius Pilate was ruler down there, but there was another guy up in Galilee. And when he heard, oh, Jesus is from Galilee, he had Jesus tried by Agrippa up there as well. So that's some of the confusion that we'll get to later. Does anyone have any questions about this? Now, time's up and we could go on for a lot longer, but that's kind of a good background for the world of the New Testament that we're about to enter into. Any questions?
How concrete was the messianic hope by the time of Jesus?
I don't know how to answer that. How concrete?
Like everyone was talking about, is this him, or how? Is there some kind of gauge that we have?
I'm sure there were people who just didn't care, who were just wanted to make money with their business, their bakery, or whatever. But we see it coming up a lot. So when Gamaliel, when Peter's on trial in the beginning of Acts, they mention different people who had risen up, other zealots and stuff. So there had been multiple riots. It was kind of on people's minds. You know, when Jesus goes up even into Samaria, you know, the Samaritan woman almost immediately goes, "Sir, I perceive you are a prophet." And really not a prophet, the prophet, because they didn't believe in the prophets after Moses. So you're the Messiah, right? As soon as she heard him. So it was on people's minds. The messianic hope, there was a lot of people hoping. I don't know how many people. No way for me to really know. But there was an expectation. And it wasn't just in Israel. I mean, you see the wise men out in the east coming, expecting. When Jesus is born, they're not. What? The Messiah's coming now? It was, you know, they all agreed. They were just figuring out where he was supposed to be born and so on. So it was well known. It was the hope. Any other questions? There are no tests in this class. So
It's like drinking from a fire hydrant.
yeah, there's a lot that happens. You have to kind of hear the story a bunch of times and then it gets more familiar. But that kind of gives a little context for the rise of these groups, Pharisees, Sadducees, that you don't see in the Old Testament, but they're there in the New Testament. The Roman soldiers, the Greek language and culture. So that's how we get from Malachi to Matthew. Well, thank you all. Let me pray. Lord, thank you for how you direct the world, not just in the times that we know about, but all the times that are silent, the times where we're suffering. Thank you for being sovereign over all and for the little ways that we can see how you're preparing the world for the coming of your Son, and how you prepare even our own lives for, you know, preparing us to hear the gospel, to come to you at the right time. We ask that you would help us to trust you in all times. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you all. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel.
See you later. Next week,
Thank-
Matt.